the Friendly Podcast Guide. Every week, I put out an episode about a specific podcast to help you figure out if it's your next favorite podcast. Those episodes come out on Tuesdays. I also put out another episode each Thursday that's a little more personal, like a list of podcasts I like for the season we're in, how I'm using podcasts in my own life, or something like that. This is one of those episodes, and this week it's all about celebrating the 100th episode of the Friendly Podcast Guide. I listen to so many podcasts, and I'm always finding new ones that I fall in love with, but there are a few that are my go-tos that never let me down, and so because this is the 100th episode of my show, I decided to be a little selfish and talk about some of my personal favorite podcasts. The first podcast on my list of favorites is The Lazy Genius. Kendra Adachi is the host, and she does such a wonderful job of explaining things in a way that makes them feel doable and not overwhelming. I learned so much from each of her episodes, and I love the reminder that she gives in every episode to be a genius about the things that matter and lazy about the things that don't. Also, the Lazy Genius community is one of my favorite places on the internet. All of the women in the community are smart, kind, and non-judgmental. They are so lovely. If you want to try out a Lazy Genius episode, I highly recommend starting with episode 301, How to Kindly Navigate a Changing Body. It's a great example of Kendra talking about a difficult topic with grace and kindness. I really love this episode, and I think you will too. Have you heard of Sharon Says So on Instagram? This next podcast is by the woman behind that account, Sharon McMahon. It's called Here's Where It Gets Interesting, and all of her episodes are interesting and thought-provoking, but in my opinion, where her podcast shines the brightest is in the series that she and her team put together. She's done series on the civil rights movement, the Civil War, First Ladies of the White House, Japanese internment camps in the U.S. during World War II, and so many more. Each series does a deep dive on whatever that topic is, and Sharon and her team do such a wonderful job of showing you the humanity in whatever group of people they're talking about. After I'm done listening to each of these series, I always am inspired to become a better person, and I feel so much more informed about the world that I live in. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Governords, which is the community of people Sharon has brought together. These are wonderful humans who are curious and kind. If you want to try out Here's Where It Gets Interesting but don't know where to start, I recommend starting with her series about women who won World War II. This 12-part series is so inspiring, and I loved learning about all of the women who helped the Allies win the Second World War. Before I tell you about more of my favorite podcasts, we're going to take a quick break to talk about how I'm celebrating the 100th episode of the Friendly Podcast Guide. This week, we're celebrating 100 episodes by giving away a $25 Amazon gift card. It's easy to enter. All you have to do is hop on Instagram and talk about why you love podcasts and how you use the Friendly Podcast Guide in your life. Then, tag the Friendly Podcast Guide so that I can know that you did it. If you have a private account, then just DM me a screenshot of your story or post so that I can make sure you're in the drawing to win the gift card. I can't wait to hear about all the reasons you love podcasts and how you use FPG in your life. I'll be announcing the winner next week on June 29th, so make sure to talk about the show before the 29th. This next podcast is a bit more specific, but it's so beautifully produced that if you listen and love it, you'll probably be a fan for life. It's called 20,000 Hertz. Dallas Taylor is the host, and he and his team put together the most lovely podcast episodes about sound and how sound affects us in our daily lives. There are episodes about the voices you hear when you use the tube in London, the rivalry between synth instruments, the iconic Windows startup sounds, and so many more. If you want to try out 20,000 Hertz, I recommend starting with the episode called Dies Irae. It's the first episode I listened to, and it obviously got me hooked. This episode is about a 4-note melody that composers have been using for hundreds of years to evoke death. Fascinating, right? This melody has been used in dozens of movies, and once you hear it, you'll probably start noticing it more and more. The next podcast on this list of favorites is the Popcast with Knox and Jamie. One of my favorite ways to end a really hard day is turning on the Popcast. Knox and Jamie and their producer Aaron have some of the most hilarious conversations I've ever had the privilege to listen in on. And I'm so grateful they make a show that educates me on the things that entertain but do not matter. If you want to try out the podcast with Knox and Jamie, you could scroll through and just click an episode that sounds interesting. But if that sounds like too much work, then a great episode to listen to is called Nepo Babies. Knox and Jamie talk about nepotism in pop culture, and the episode is both thought-provoking and hilarious. And last on the list, but definitely not least, is All Things Cozy. I actually found this podcast while doing research for the Friendly Podcast Guide. It is delightful. If you ever need to add a little coziness to your day, just turn on an episode of All Things Cozy, and you'll immediately feel better. Matt and Jillian are the hosts, and they are best friends that bring so much joy and warmth to each episode that you can't help but feel like you just got a virtual hug. They're also clever and funny, and I always finish each episode feeling like I just had a lovely conversation with two good friends. If you want to get a feel for the vibe of All Things Cozy, I recommend listening to the episode Matt and Jillian did on the Friendly Podcast Guide, where we talked about the origins of their show, how they describe the feeling of All Things Cozy, and you can listen to us become real friends instead of me just thinking they're really awesome and them not knowing who I am. And that is a wrap on the 100th episode of the Friendly Podcast Guide. Thank you for indulging me as I gush about some of my very favorite podcasts, and I'm so grateful that you listen to the show. If you just found the show or you've been with me since the beginning, I'm so grateful to help you on your podcast journey. Also, I can't wait to hear about your podcast experiences and give away an Amazon gift card. Talk to you soon.